Hey guys, this is for the sophomores. I noticed that a bunch of you haven't watched the last video yet, so please do that. Rags to riches if you haven't watched that yet, and remember to watch these videos from start to finish. I know this was a rough weekend for our country with uh, the violence in America's cities to protest a grievous wrong that happened in Minneapolis last week to George Floyd. And people responding, like they did this weekend with marches and protests. And I think the one big takeaway from all these protests is that the most American thing is to protest injustice and to protest when something is wrong and needs to be changed. There were some people infiltrated the protests, intent on causing damage to people who really had who have nothing to do with police violence. Stores and restaurants and the like that were targeted, and that's wrong. And people often infiltrate these protests in order to try to advance their own agenda by latching themselves on to legitimate protests, or people just want to undermine the whole protest at all. Period. So that's important to keep in mind, to separate legitimate protest against injustice and the violence that's committed by those who often infiltrate the protests for their own reasons. But there's nothing more American than protesting against the injustice that we saw happen last week in Minneapolis. But that happens all too often in our country toward people of color. Um, so it's something that we have to be mindful of, even when the headlines. When this headline might disappear, it's something that we have to continue working toward improving. Let's be aware of our own biases, which we might not recognize or might not acknowledge, but that we all have. And let's not get defensive about it, but let's strive to actually to work on those biases and make sure that we treat everyone fairly and the way we would want to be treated. Okay, so today we're going to talk about labor unions. Now, labor unions kind of were created to do the things that we just talked about, to try to improve people's living conditions. Now, remember during the Gilded Age, we talked about this in all these previous videos, but we have this huge disparity in wealth between the very rich and the very poor, right? And often there was a relationship there. I became very rich by keeping you very poor. So the thing is that a lot of workers said we have to do something to improve our living conditions. And the best way some workers felt to do that was to form a union. Now, a union is a group of workers who will generally do the same job, who band together to fight for better working conditions. So the idea of unionization is I could go to my boss, ask for a raise, improvement in living conditions, and he could say, no, get lost. Not my boss, not Mr. Weiss is nice, but I mean just some factory owner. If I went individually and asked for a raise or better conditions, he could have just said no. But if all the workers get together and go to the boss and ask for better conditions, then the boss has to listen a lot more. You have a lot more leverage if all the workers join together. The whole idea of unions rely on the concept of collective bargaining, that everybody bands together to fight for better conditions. Now, the United States has been historically hostile to labor unions, a lot more than other countries in the Western world. A lot of them. Why is that? Well, a lot of Americans feel that unions are socialistic. The idea of banding together to fight for better conditions, that's the total opposite of the whole American ideal of rugged individualism, right? That what I get on my own. Right, I don't need to band together with others in order to improve my living conditions and wages or whatever. So for a lot of people, during this time, and honestly, to this day, there are still a lot of people feel this way, but unions are un-American. That we should be a nation of individual strivers. We shouldn't be a nation of people just banding together and to fight for things. Now, unions also tend to be politically progressive. So a lot of people who aren't politically progressive see unions as a threat for that reason. Now, unions during the Gilded Age faced serious obstacles. It wasn't so easy to say, hey, let's all join a union. There were serious ethnic divisions among workers that that bosses exploited in order to stop people from joining unions, like trying to discourage the lighter whites from joining unions with darker whites. A huge division between the skilled and the unskilled. That's a big one. A lot of skilled workers didn't want to join unions with unskilled workers because they felt they were better, more skilled, obviously. And also the government and the court system during the Gilded Age were extreme, and into the 20th century were extremely hostile to labor unions, and they twisted the law to try to suit that end. So they wanted to control labor unions. They felt that labor unions were wrong, a threat to the country's way of life and economy or whatever. So the government and the court system tried their best to stymie or block people trying to join unions and strike and all that sort of thing. So the unions face so many obstacles on almost every front. Ethnic divisions between skilled and unskilled, and of course the hostile government and court system that existed. Now, a lot of people don't realize this, but in fact, I didn't until I really started studying this, because the narrative is that business was just booming, unregulated, nobody complained, people just tolerated the conditions of the time throughout the Gilded Age. That's kind of the narrative that exists, but that's not entirely accurate. There was serious labor unrest during the Gilded Age, during the late 19th century. Unions were weak. Generally, strikes generally were often unorganized. It wasn't like a union said, "Oh, we're all going on strike." It was just random workers here and there going out on strike. So it was kind of disorganized. They call those wildcat strikes when they're not centrally organized. But from 1881 until 1905, there were 37,000 strikes in the United States. That was during the height of the Gilded Age, this narrative is that the power of big business was not being controlled by anybody. But 37,000 strikes during those years shows that workers were trying to do whatever they could in their power to try to improve their living conditions. Now, remember, the reason why unions are important is the only way workers really have any leverage at all to improve their wages, their hours, their conditions, their benefits, or whatever, is by banding together, right? A single worker against a rich businessman doesn't really have much of a chance to improve his or her conditions. But all the workers together gives them leverage against the boss. Well, no, I shouldn't even say against, but gives them leverage with the boss. And it's the only way they really have it. So unions are very important just for that reason. So even if you strip the politics out of it, just common sense, right? That the only way workers have influence is if all the workers band together. Now, the first major union in America was a union called the Knights of Labor. The official name of it was the Noble and Holy Order of the Knights of Labor. And the Knights of Labor welcomed skilled and unskilled workers. They said anybody who produces something, and all wage earners and people who produce things can join the Knights of Labor. The only people who were excluded were gamblers, lawyers, and bankers, because the idea was these three groups don't produce anything. Very, very interesting commentary there that they're making. I think. But so it was a pretty open union. And the Knights of Labor was also significant because it embraced a far-reaching liberal agenda. That's another division we didn't talk about, but that exists within the union movement. Some unions say, let's just focus on improving conditions for our people, the workers in our union, while other unions are focused more on reforming society. That's a big division between unions. Some believe we should just focus on our own people. Others say no, we have to improve society, move in a more progressive direction. Well, the Knights of Labor definitely fell in that camp. They embraced a far-reaching liberal agenda that, for the time, was quite radical. Equal pay for women. My God forbid, right? They embraced that. They urged an end to child labor, which, remember, was a serious problem during the Gilded Age. An end to convict labor, so we can't use prisoners to do free work. There should be employer-employee ownership of the factories. You can imagine how that would go over in a country like ours, which is very hostile to anything that sounds vaguely socialistic. And also progressive income tax, that the more you make, the more money you should pay in taxes. So it was a far-reaching liberal agenda. The Knights of Labor grew in the 1880s under the leadership of a man named Terence Powderly. Powderly was an Irish immigrant. He emerged to lead the Knights of Labor, and he had some interesting ideas. The biggest one that, in fact, is quite surprising is that he opposed striking. Saying that we should focus more on negotiation between employers and employees, feeling that striking is too hostile. I'm just assuming everybody knows what a strike is, but a strike is when you decide not to go to, well, not decide, but when you don't go to work, right, until a certain conditions are met. Like we're not going to go to work until we get a raise. All of us are going to stop going to work until we reduce our hours, or so on. Now, striking is the biggest leverage that a union has, right? That if our conditions aren't met, or if we don't get a fair deal, we're going to walk out and we're not going to work. So, opposing striking really undermines you as a union, I think, but whatever. Powderly opposed alcohol. He was a temperance guy. He supported black rights at a time when that wasn't very popular. So Powderly was a pretty progressive and focused on reform, on just general reform. Women could also join the Knights of Labor. 10% of all the members of the Knights of Labor were women. On the flip side, though, Powderly and the Knights of Labor supported serious restrictions on immigration, particularly by Chinese immigrants. Now, the one liberal cause that the union was never really embraced was open immigration, or really immigration at all, because the idea was if workers come from other countries, they work cheap and they bring down wages for American workers and for union members. So unions historically have been opposed to immigration, or at least opposed to unrestricted immigration, and particularly Chinese immigration, because Chinese people were seen as a group of folks who will work for very cheap and undercut the wages of other workers. Anti-Chinese violence out west was often instigated by labor interests. Sadly, in 1877, the Union destroyed 25 Chinese-owned businesses in San Francisco, and the Union, the Knights of Labor, was at the vanguard of pushing for legislation banning Chinese immigration, which ultimately happened in 1882 when Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned Chinese people from coming to the United States. So the only group ever that have been singled out in particular to not be allowed to come into our country. So that's not good. But I don't know exactly when unions made the shift, but historically unions have been pretty hostile to immigration, including good into the 20th century, because of the fear about what immigrant labor would do to wages. In 1882, the Knights of Labor held the first Labor Day parade in New York City. This is before Labor Day was a holiday. Labor Day ultimately became a holiday in the 1890s because workers didn't get any days off except Christmas and Sundays. So Labor Day was created just as at least one day that workers will get off, and in tribute to all the work they do for the rest of the year. Now, 1885 was Powderly's greatest triumph. Jay Gould, who was a big railroad tycoon during this time, tried to fire union activists. That's another tactic that bosses use. If they thought that some of their workers were union members or trying to encourage others to join a union, they fired them. You know, thinking that, you know, if you fire the union organizers, then the rest of my workers won't get ideas in their head to join unions. So that was a common tactic that was used by bosses during this time and into the 20th century. And when Jay Gould fired these union activists who worked for him, the Knights of Labor walked off the job. And not only did they walk off the job, but Knights of Labor throughout the country refused to handle any railroad cars that were owned by Jay Gould. So this was really playing some hardball, and it was going against their opposition to striking. I know, but Jay Gould ultimately had to negotiate with the Knights of Labor, and he promised that he would no longer be encouraging anti-union activity. So the thing is that, you know, this was a big success, and it shows that when all the workers band together, there's greater chance of the union being successful. The Knights of Labor in 1886 ultimately had 700,000 members, which is really, really good. But 1886 is generally seen as the year when the Knights of Labor collapsed, and that was because of the Haymarket Square riots. Now, let's talk a little bit about that. Now, the most important day for the union movement or the workers' rights movement is May 1st, May Day. That's like the workers' holiday. That's why in communist countries, which think of themselves as you know, workers' paradises, May Day is the biggest holiday of the year. So May 1st historically is the most important day for organized labor, for workers, for unions. So there was a rally on May Day, 1886. 300,000 workers walked off their job throughout to fight for an 8-hour day. This was another big cause for the union movement. This was, remember, at a time when people were working 12, 14-hour days. The idea behind the 8-hour day was that this is the way your life should be. 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, 8 hours to do as you please. So that's the fair way to treat people, is for them to only have to work 8 hours a day. Now, Chicago police killed 4 strikers at a McCormick plant on May Day. McCormick, they're the ones who make the Reapers, which were instrumental in the agricultural revolution in the 1840s. It revolutionized mechanized farming. So 4 workers went on strike at the McCormick plant. Not 4 workers. The workers went on strike, and the Chicago police killed 4 of them. The next day, a protest rally was held in Haymarket Square in Chicago to protest that the police killing. So this is very relevant, honestly, to our discussion from the beginning of the video on what's going on in our world now. But to protest this police killing of the workers a day earlier, on May 2nd, a protest rally was held in Haymarket Square, Chicago. Somebody threw a bomb, and seven cops were killed. And nobody knows who threw the bomb. It was just, again, like we talked about in the beginning of this video, it's very common for infiltrators who have outside agendas, particularly anarchist types, who were around then, and in fact, and were strong then, and around now and it's still around. So sometimes they try to latch onto a legitimate protest or a legitimate movement and use violence to advance their own separate agenda, which is what I think we're seeing now in around the country. So this happened in 1886. Well, the union was blamed for the violence because, well, it was your rally, where these cops were killed, and a lot of business leaders and the middle class who never liked the idea of unions attacked the Knights of Labor and attacked this idea that the unions are radical. They're dangerous. They're foreign influenced. That was another canard that people constantly used against unions. Now, this was a really tragic event, not only for those 7 police officers who were killed, but no one knows who did it. But the Chicago authorities just arrested randomly 8 people who were at a rally and charged them with murder of the police. And there was no evidence against them. All of them were convicted, and 4 of them were executed. despite the fact there was no evidence at all. So this is, I guess this is very, I believe me, I didn't plan it this way to do this video this day, but this is actually very, very timely discussing this, right? This was, police violence against civilians. We have a protest against the police violence, which is infiltrated by outside group that used violence, and ultimately discredits the movement, which I hope doesn't happen here. Today. So this incident really did discredit the union movement, contributed to great anti-union animosity in the country, and reinforced these negative impressions that unions are dangerous, saying that, oh yeah, as soon as we get unions, we get radical behavior and we get violence. So the Knights of Labor pretty much declined and ultimately ended, for all intents and purposes, after the Haymarket Square riots. So after the death of the Knights of Labor, there became this push to actually have a more practical-minded union, one that was focused on actually just improving conditions for their workers, as opposed to this broad societal reform agenda that was embraced by the Knights of Labor. And many skilled workers just resented being in the same union with unskilled workers, saying that's not fair. We're higher paid, we're more skilled, and there's no way we should be with these people. See, even people who are at the lower end of the economic strata sometimes try to pull rank and try to think. Everybody always has to think they're better than other people, even people who are at the bottom, unfortunately. So that was a big problem in encouraging unionization, the fact that skilled didn't want to be in the union with unskilled. And also, some people who were more moderate said, just focus on bread and butter issues, wages, hours, living conditions, instead of just focusing on how we can just make society better. And ultimately, these skilled worker unions, these craft unions, got together and formed a big new union in 1886, the year the Knights of Labor began collapsing. And that union was called the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, which is still around to this day. Now it's the AFL-CIO. Because it merged with another union in the 1950s. So the American Federation of Labor, which was led by a man named Samuel Gompers, who was a Jewish immigrant, it was focused on bread and butter issues, on wages, on hours, on improving living conditions. It was a lot more moderate politically, and it was only for skilled workers, who, as we said, did not really want to be in the same union with unskilled workers. They insisted on higher wages, and they believed the bargaining power of skilled workers could be harnessed together to bargain with corporations. They were generally, the AFL, the way it was organized is there was it was basically a federation of autonomous local unions. So unions, small, that's why people sometimes call the union my local. It was local unions located throughout the country, and they were all linked by an executive council a national council led by Gompers. But generally they were local, and they kind of ran themselves. That's the way the AFL was structured. Now, Gompers tried to avoid controversial political questions. He was moderate politically, and he just did not feel that, or he felt that, getting involved in controversial political questions could potentially discredit the union. Even though they did insist on some things, right? An 8-hour day, workman's comp laws. So if you're hurt on the job, you can get money, mine safety laws. But they were definitely more moderate politically. By 1900, there were 1.6 million members of the AFL. So that was pretty good in only 14 years. But at the turn of the century, unions were still pretty weak. Only 5% of American workers were members of unions in 1900. There was still this huge division between the skilled and the unskilled, and then we have the ethnic divisions and corporate power and all that kind of conspired to block people from joining unions. But despite the fact that unions are weak, and I remember we just talked about this a few minutes ago, but the thing is that there is still this perception that during the Gilded Age that unions were almost powerless, that workers just kind of rolled over and, just accepted all these horrendous living conditions on the whole. For the majority of people, probably, but there was significant labor unrest during the Gilded Age because conditions really were bad. Wages, hours, conditions were really quite bad. Now, the first major violent strike in American history was in 1877, the Great Railway Strike. The B&O, Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, slashed wages, which resulted in a strike of railroad workers throughout the country, from New York to San Francisco. We had never witnessed anything like that, a strike of that nature. And 2/3 of the railroads wound up not moving at all. Because the workers all went out on strike in sympathy with the B&O workers who got the wage cut. Now, there was massive violence. Often, business executives tried to use violent methods to try to stop people from joining unions. The resulting violence killed 100 people. During the Great Railway Strike, mostly workers. Ultimately, President Hayes sent troops to put down the strike. President Hayes was generally pretty liberal-minded, but such was the anti-union feeling among America's power elite that, generally there was the idea that unions have to be stopped. They're a threat. To order. And the Great Railway Strike shocked a lot of Americans. Again, a lot of Americans tended to be anti-union anyway, and many conservative-minded folks said that the violence against strikers are justified. They have no right to strike. If they don't like their working conditions, they should just quit. Right? They should not just paralyze an entire industry. So the middle class, generally, and conservative-minded people, generally feared what unions meant, because to them, unions meant mob violence. And business used this anti-union feeling that existed in the country to crack down heavily on labor. There's a lot of tactics that they used to crack down on labor. One was making workers sign what they called a yellow dog contract. A yellow dog contract said when you got the job, you had to agree that you would never join a union. And if you did, you'd be fired. Use of Pinkerton guards. Pinkerton guards were the Pinkerton agency was a private detective agency that was hired by employers and managers of factories to physically intimidate workers out of joining unions to begin with, but especially if they do and go out on strike, beat them up. Or threaten to beat them up if they don't go back to work. So these private detectives were hired to put down strikes, and a lot of them were a lot of these attempts to crush unions were actually quite violent, and also. And probably one of the most effective tactics, turning to the federal government for help. Remember, the federal government during the Gilded Age, as we talked about in previous videos, was laissez-faire, did not really believe in government regulation of business. Neither the Democratic or Republican Party really believed in that. And what they did is they asked the government, particularly the courts, to declare an injunction against a strike. So if my workers go on strike, I go to court and I say, force them to go back to work and end the strike. And if they don't, they could all be arrested. Also, the military could be used as a last resort, and was several times, to put down strikes. And the government generally was very obliging. The government was very friendly to corporate interests, very hostile to organized labor. We really didn't have an administration at all that was even sort of friendly to organized labor until Teddy Roosevelt, who was more neutral. But the first administration we had that was actually pro-union really was Franklin Roosevelt's administration in the 1930s. So think about how far off that is. Now, the Haymarket Square riot in 1886 was probably the most famous example of union violence, but 1892 was a particularly violent year. The Coeur d'Alene strike in Idaho. There's a big mines out in Idaho. There were serious pay cuts, and the workers responded. The workers out west, the unions out west, tended to be a lot more radical. That's where the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, were really strong. They were really left and were more willing to embrace violent tactics against management. Idaho miners blew up a mill, and they kidnapped the Pinkerton guards that were actually sent to put down the strike. Ultimately, the Idaho National Guard had to be brought in to cripple the strike. In 1892, Carnegie himself saw a strike. There was a strike at the steel plant because Carnegie's managers cut wages, as Carnegie often did. His workers did not get paid much at all, and he locked out union organizers. So anybody who was trying to get the workers to join a union was just locked out, was not allowed to come into work. They went out on strike. There was a few rogue workers who fired on the Pinkerton guards, which provoked a violent battle that left 10 people dead. Henry Clay Frick, who was Carnegie's #2, wound up being shot in his office and almost killed. We don't really know who did that. The National Guard came in again and crushed that strike against Carnegie. The 1894 Pullman strike, which we talked about in a few videos ago, during the Cleveland administration, against the Pullman Company, which made the luxury cars on trains. So there were some really big strikes during the Gilded Age. But the business leaders generally knew that public opinion was on their side, that the American public, by and large, did not like the idea of organized labor, and they used that feeling successfully to try to crush the power of unions, and using the government and public opinion to go after unions. And union recruitment met with very limited success. There's always people who are scared, right? They're afraid to join the union because they think they're going to lose their jobs if they join the unions, and especially so. If workers were faced with hostility all around, right? They had a hostile government that was on the side of corporations, corporate interests that could potentially fire them if they join a union, and of course their own self-doubt, right, and fears about what could happen if they join a union. They lose their livelihood. But in the end of the day, even as we got to the end of the Gilded Age, unions were still seen by many as radical, foreign-inspired, banding together to fight for conditions. That's obviously a foreign concept. I'm serious. People did think that. They were dangerous, they were violent, and ultimately they were un-American. And this prevailing feeling really limited the success of the union movement during this time. All right, guys, so I know this was a long video. Again, remember, watch from start to finish. I can't think of anything better to binge watch than these videos. So yeah, so especially if you've missed any, make sure you catch up. In our next video, we're going to talk about the growth of the growth of the American city and how that was an outgrowth of the Gilded Age as well. All right, so stay safe. If you're engaging in any civil disobedience, or you're at home quarantining and social distancing, either way, please stay safe. All right, see you in the next video. Peace.